Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable member Calgary Centre.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank all my colleagues here and congratulate all my colleagues for the first time for winning the 44th election and making sure we come here and discuss Canada's issues in the Parliament. And I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to more debate in this House of Commons. The first thing I have to do, because it's the first time I've risen in this House since that election, is thank the constituents of Calgary Centre for giving me the honour of coming back here and making sure I represent their interests in this House of Commons on the debates we're going to have in this House of Commons and make sure we have better legislation for Canadians going forward. I also want to thank my campaign team, of course, my wife in particular, who has always been my biggest supporter. But today we're going to talk about Bill C-2 and how we actually try and make that better. This is about government spending. It's one of the main things that government does. But I also want to talk about inflation, especially monetary inflation, cost of living increases, and of course asset inflation. But let's start with the fiscal situation. Federal government debt. When I ran for Parliament in 2019, I decided to become a candidate because I thought Canada was overspending. We were spending our children's money in order to go deeper and deeper into debt to pay for today's programming at the expense of tomorrow's taxpayers. Well, in 2019, Canada's debt was $721 billion. And where is it now? It is actually $1.234 billion. Pardon me, $1.234 trillion. And I'll pardon myself again, Madam Speaker, to make sure that something I forgot at the beginning of this speech is to indicate to you that I will be splitting my time with the honourable member from Edmonton West. Back to where we are in the fiscal situation. $1.234 trillion in debt. $500 billion more in debt than we were 2 years ago. The government's based this on what they want to continue as a debt to GDP ratio of around 53%. Now that's up from 30% only a few years ago. That's a ridiculous increase. And the government plans to leave it there in its spending plans for the foreseeable future, as if arriving at a 53% debt to GDP ratio is the goal. Just keep adding debt so a debt ratio of our country is kept high, and it is very high. This is a government that believes it does not have to make choices about where it spends taxpayers' dollars or borrowed funds from future generations. Interest rates are low because the debt issued is held by a Bank of Canada. Interestingly, in a technocrat's approach to excess leverage, a Canadian Crown corporation buys the debt that it issues to the government to pay for its spending. It's a nice balance sheet trick where the entity setting the market rate for issuing government debt actually participates in the market as a buyer to ensure that the debt is bought at that market rate. The end result of this is the Bank of Canada, a funded subsidiary of the Government of Canada, and whose debts are guaranteed by the taxpayers of Canada, has grown their balance sheet from $105 billion in 2020 to over $500 billion today. Of course, it has the bonds on its balance sheet, guaranteed by the taxpayers of Canada as well, but let's remember that it bought these bonds, some from bond sellers in the open market, at a rate that it's set at very low. Now, a little background is required to understand this. Low interest rates, or coupons as they are sometimes called, equate to higher bond prices. The correlation is automatic. So when the government is buying bonds from market participants at a low market rate that it sets, it is overpaying for the bond. Eventually, rates will reset higher. Higher rates equal lower prices for the bonds on the Bank of Canada's balance sheet. What does that mean? It means the adjustment to reducing the quantitative easing experiment, which the government is participating, is going to be very expensive. We are buying high, and we will need to sell lower. How much lower? Well, with an increase of $400 billion on its balance sheet, normalization will require a loss of billions of dollars of value for the Bank of Canada per year until $400 billion of Government of Canada debt has been sold into the market. This quantitative easing, a way for central bankers to keep public spending ratcheting higher in any iteration in any country, has never shown a path out. We are experimenting here without any concept of the outcome. Remember Canada's debt total, $1.234 trillion. About 40% of that is now held by the Bank of Canada. So we, the people of Canada, have become the de facto only buyer of Canada's debt. And those billions in impacted losses onto Canada's fiscal deficits going forward because they are not included in any of the fiscal plans at this time. You know, the plans that have Canada continuing to have a debt to GDP ratio above 50% for the foreseeable future. And remember, even after the recession of 2008-2009, that ratio was only 30%. Canada is on a train to a cliff, and the conductor is not looking ahead. There is no magic money tree. Canadians will recall the last time in our recent history when government spending grew out of control, from the Trudeau government deficits in the 1970s and 1980s. With rising interest rates, payments on our national debt became the government's largest expense line item. Taxpayers were paying bondholders excessive amounts of interest, bondholders from around the world. And those tens of billions of dollars per year that taxpayers contributed could not be allocated to programs like improvements in our healthcare system. The final outcome of this period was the Chrétien Liberal government cutting federal funding to healthcare in 1996. At the time, Canada's second largest budget line item after interest payments on debt. Is this foreshadowing? Canadians still have healthcare, although the federal government's share has fallen from the conventional 50% to 22%. The rest has been thrust onto the backs of the provinces unilaterally. Provinces' finances have suffered ever since. Let's think about this government's promises on spending in provincial government jurisdiction on borrowed money. What happens to these services when the bill becomes due? Debt ratio metrics are only relevant when we're comparing to other countries. As far as balance sheets of governments go, the measure is irrelevant. Corporations have debt-to-value ratios because it is a measure of how they can leverage their operations with cheaper tax-assisted financing and therefore earn a higher return for their owners. That notion does not exist for governments, and no government should ever embrace the notion that a country accumulates debt that it will never pay back. It is an excuse to have future generations of Canadians pay for today's expenses as if our children won't have their own bills to pay with their own taxes. They will be paying for decades for services we've delivered today. As I say, in comparison to other governments, and remember that the country's debt profile is not just the federal government debt, we need to include provincial government debt, which has skyrocketed during COVID because of the province's need to increase healthcare funding during a health crisis. And it also includes corporate debt, which has increased remarkably, and household debt. In total, Canada's debt to GDP ratio rose by 80% in 2020, by far the largest increase in the world. The closest runner-up in this ratcheting metric was Japan at a 50% increase. The US saw a 45% increase, UK saw a 35% increase, China saw a 30% increase, Australia only had a 12% increase. So comparably, Canada stands alone in its profligacy. Monetary inflation leads to asset inflation, most exemplified by the housing market. Mortgage debt increased by $100 billion. Canadian households are personally in debt for $2.5 trillion, or $65,000 per capita. Mortgage debt has increased by 22%. Single-family home prices have increased by a similar amount, 23% over the past year. And now Canada stands at the top of the most overvalued housing markets in the world, whereas in the US, the increase in real disposable income slightly exceeds real home prices. In Canada, housing prices have increased at a rate almost double the increase in real disposable debt. Madam Speaker, I know I'm running out here of time, but this is trouble. This is trouble that we need to address here at this level so we understand what the future looks like for Canada's finances. We need to examine this bill closely in an actual Team Canada approach. In that respect, I'm looking forward to this bill's review at the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance, where all members of the House of Commons will be able to provide input to ensure the bill meets the needs and expectations of Canadians. Thank you.
Questions et commentaires. The honourable member King's Hands.
I'd like to thank the member opposite for his intervention. I've been here for 2 years and I found him to be quite articulate in his points. But one thing that concerns me in his speech, and he talked a lot about debts and deficits, he almost made no mention of the fact that we've just gone through a global pandemic and the fact that the government has had to intervene to be able to make sure that Canadian businesses and individuals were supported. This is not just Canada. This has been across the globalized economy. Countries have been intervening. So my question to him would be, would he suggest we have not intervened? And let's bring it back to C-2, because that's what we're here about right now. Does he support this legislation? Does he think that this is needed, notwithstanding his treatise on debt and deficit spending? Thank you.
The honourable member Calgary Centre.
Well, I thank my colleague for the intervention. I'm much happy to see him back in the House of Commons for this debate, and I hope we can continue to have this debate in the House of Commons. Yes, there are some issues around C-2 that we need to address. I'd like to address them in committee so we can get to the details on them. We do need to provide some support for some Canadians going forward here to make sure we come out of this transition, but we need to do so very effectively. We have overspent in many ways. We can talk about the money that's gone out in fraud payments. We can talk about organized crime and its participation in the targeted programs that were delivered during the COVID. We need to make sure that we look at this. We also need to acknowledge the provinces and how much they've had to increase their spending to deal with the actual on-the-ground expenses of healthcare. Those are things that I hope we can address very clearly in committee, and I thank my colleague again for that question.
Commentaires. Questions and comments. The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you. I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his speech. I had the privilege of attending university with him more years ago than I care to admit, but I want to welcome him back to the House, and I always appreciate his thoughtful speeches. My question concerns something that I think is most important to most Canadians when we talk about the economy, and that's jobs. For every Canadian, that is their economy. It's how they get their revenue. It's how they afford their expenditures. So my questions are directed towards that. Number one, does my honourable colleague think that the Bank of Canada should be looking at amending its mandate, which is coming up soon, to include a full employment strategy? And second, does he not agree that if businesses are having a hard time finding employees right now, that this is a market signal that perhaps employers in those industries need to increase their wages and working conditions in order to attract more people to those jobs in a classic economic theory?
Member for Calgary Centre.
I thank my old friend from Vancouver Kingsway for the intervention and his very good question. A lot of things in that question that I want to address here. One of which, of course, we call in economic theory the Gini coefficient. And what's happened during this pandemic is an outflow of funds have gone into the richest Canadians' pockets. You take a look at the increase in houses in Canada, it's gone up by 24%. You look at the increase in the stock market since COVID started, it's gone up by 62%. What percentage of Canadians actually participate in owning these assets? About the top quarter. So the top quarter of Canadians have gotten excessively rich in this process. The bottom 75%, shall we say, ballpark figure, have not done that well. The assets they have to pay for have gone up in price. As a result, there is less income equality happening in Canada. We need to address that. That has been part of the failure of COVID spending, what we need to address in making sure we get this programming correct going forward. Thank you again.
Time for a brief question. The honourable member for Scarborough-Guildwood.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his speech. And the narrative of the Conservative Party in particular has been blame the Government of Canada for all inflation ills. However, putting that aside for the time being, I'd be interested in his comments on the mismatch between supply and demand. There's a buildup of demand over the course of the pandemic because people had no place to go, no place to spend, and then there's now a huge demand for goods and services, and that's been interrupted by supply chain problems. So I'd be interested in his thoughts as that affects inflation.
Brief answer from the member Calgary Centre.
I thank my colleague for the intervention very much. Yes, there has been a an interruption in supply and demand during the brief 3-month period where there was actual total lockdown. The adjustment to that period has, of course, occurred. We are looking now at an adjustment that's going to continue going forward and making sure that that supply and demand continue to meet. We are talking about ratcheting prices here for everyday Canadians. This is something that's going to be reflected in their cost of living, and it's exactly, I think, what we're driving at here. If their cost of living continues to increase, where does that actually spiral? It actually spirals into more inflation. It is not deflation, as the government's financial team seems to think it was not so long ago. It is inflationary, and my party's been calling for that. The outcome of monetary policy, of course, is always going to be inflation. Loose monetary policy leads to inflation. We have escalating prices, and I thank you again for the comment.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for